Thank you to our sponsors for supporting this episode of Troxel, BQE Core, and Avail. We'll share more about them later on in the episode. Welcome to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel. This is the podcast where I have a conversation with guests from the architectural community and beyond to talk about the coevolution of architecture and technology. In this episode, I welcome Paul Petrunia. Paul is the founder and director of ArchiNect, the internet's first online publication, job board, and community platform for the architecture industry. He's also the publisher of Ed Magazine, founder of Brutal Coffee, founder of Bustler, and co-producer/co-host of the podcast ArchiNect Sessions. In this episode, we discussed the early days of the internet that we experienced and how ArchiNect began, which was born out of Paul's architectural education at SciArc. But the real reason for talking with Paul was to dig into why ArchiNect was started in the first place and how the community has evolved over the years, especially in the larger landscape of social media, podcasting, and blogging. We also discussed the role of an entity like ArchiNect having and expressing their values on the internet as guideposts for a community, the idea of your name versus pseudonyms on platforms in regards to expressing one's thoughts and cancel culture, the civility or lack thereof in conversations online today, the different ways in which people communicate online, the effects of social media on one's mental health, and so much more. This was a fantastic conversation with Paul, who I also ride mountain bikes with, so it was great to catch up with him on a professional level. And I hope you'll not only find value in it for yourself, but that you'll help add value to the profession by sharing it with your network. In addition to leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, it's the smallest act of generosity you can do to support this show and to help broaden the reach of conversations like these in my attempt to elevate the industry. I would also appreciate you visiting the sponsors who help make this episode possible. Thank you so much. So without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Paul Petrunia. Paul, welcome to the podcast. It's great to see you. And you know, it's been so long since we've seen each other. How's your mountain bike?
It's I don't know if I filled you in. By the way, thanks for having me, Evan. It's great to be on the show. Yeah, I think I told you there was a problem with the spindle on my bike. So my company is sending me new parts, and it's just my bike sitting there looking at me, with those sad eyes every day. I'm just not going to take the risk in cracking that.
Yeah, definitely a good idea. They're too expensive to break.
Yeah, mountain bikes especially have entered into the luxury item category, it seems like these days.
Well, they make the parts out of, what is it, like unobtainium now, right? So it's a supply chain issue. It's a cost issue. They cost as much as cars. So anyway, I fill the audience in. Paul and I have ridden mountain bikes together a few times, and Paul is an expert rider. It's fun to go riding with you. So I'm looking forward to more adventures on the trail.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a blast riding with you. I just try to keep up with you.
Well, I'm super caffeinated, ready to talk about architectural community.
I am, yeah. It was a strange feeling like unprepared to talk about myself and what I do. But then I realized, what kind of research can I do before an interview like this? So I guess I'm ready as I'll ever be.
This is the way, Paul. This is how we do it. There's no research to be done. I think, one thing that I've been intrigued in is building architectural community, and something that this show addresses. What's the right word? Like it's just kind of adjacent, right? Like that there is a AEC tech community out there, and I know that your community is different than that, but I think that that's something that I wanted to talk to you about, because you were one of the early architectural communities on the internet, maybe even one of the first, right? So you and I both are similarly I don't want to say aged, but but we started on the internet when it was early days, and you specifically really went in that direction from architecture school, and so I think that your perspective is great on this, and you've created an active community online with ArchiConnect. So I just wanted to kind of open up the conversation with that, and we'll see where it goes. I have some other ideas, but we'll see what happens here. So maybe you can kind of take us back and tell us the story of how ArchiConnect began, and maybe some of the interesting things that have happened over the years. I can imagine there's got to be a lot of good stories in there.
So going all the way back, this is a story that I've told a few times, so apologies to anybody that's heard it before. But, I guess my passion for architecture began when I was quite young. And as a kid who was passionate about architecture and really curious about what was going on in the world of contemporary architecture, as opposed to, historic architecture, which has always been relatively easily accessible by anybody in terms of, reading through books or traveling. As a kid, I would ride my bike to the local university in Victoria, British Columbia, where I grew up, to pick up copies of magazines like A+U and Architectural Record and Progressive Architect. It was just so mind blowing, the kind of work that these publications were publishing, that was almost completely inaccessible to the average person. These magazines were not available at newsstands or in bookstores. You really had to go to academic institutions to find them, at least where I was growing up. So, fast forward a few years, I was studying architecture. I was at the University of Oregon I started in 1995, right away at the University of Oregon, since they were quite tech forward at the time, which was surprising because I actually went there for their sustainable design program. So as much of a kind of a crunchy hippie type of environment, it was also very advanced. So there were opportunities to pick up web design, and there were professors there that I was learning under that were very supportive of learning how to do this on my own with some help from some of the teachers there. So I did that, and I eventually designed a website for the School of Architecture and Allied Arts for University of Oregon. I did a million different variations of my own personal website at the time, which didn't have much to put in, as a first year
I think when
architecture student.
We talked about this idea as there was definitely animated spinning logos on every website back then. Right?
Yeah, I can't deny that my website didn't have anything spinning and animated. But, in 95, that was the beginning of images on the internet. Up until Netscape 1.0, which is what I started on, images were not even possible. You just had to kind of pick a background color. I think the font options were pretty limited to Times New Roman and maybe Arial.
Remember that gray, that medium light gray background that was just the default color that the web browser used to render everything on top of it? It's so odd to me because it wasn't just a white background. It wasn't just like a white page. It was like that light shade of gray. What was the hex for that that shade of gray? That's what
I think it was E3 E3. Yeah, it was a light gray, probably inspired by the color of a mid 90s desktop computer. Yeah, so once I started creating websites for myself and the school, and I started creating websites for some of my class projects, I started to recognize the potential in solving the problem that I encountered as a kid. I saw this as an opportunity to provide information and content to anyone who wants it around the world using this new medium. And then, shortly after that, I recognized the ability to kind of bring people together and communicate online, as the possibilities that the internet brought became more apparent. So I started ArchiConnect in 1997. I think it was the first architecture community. I remember there were a couple architecture websites around. I think there was an architecture bookstore here in California that had a website, but the amount of architectural presence on the internet was next to nothing at the time. So, and there were no, there was no social media. I think MySpace started in '99, so there was nothing at the time. So yeah, so I created Arconnect with this goal. The name Arconnect was architecture connection. The idea was to bring people together. I was at the time especially excited about sharing the work of this exciting young emerging group of web designers that I thought were using the web in a very architectural way. In that architecture is really kind of a blending of art and science. And these web designers were, just popping out of nowhere because, again, they had this new canvas that had an audience of, potentially the entire world. So, so I started inviting web designers to participate. I started bringing in a lot of the local architecture community. It started out in a very similar way that Facebook started. Facebook kind of started it in the Harvard community, and
you had to have a Harvard edu address even to get on it at that point, I think, right?
Yeah. And so SciArc was where I was studying at the time in '97. I had transferred from University of Oregon to SciArc, and when I got to SciArc, I was totally blown away by the work that the students were pinning up on the walls in terms of just kind of stunning visuals and really interesting concepts and ideas. So I thought, okay, this is a great opportunity to really, it's one thing for contemporary architecture to be difficult to access at that time, but to see what kids in school were doing, the future of the industry were studying in school, that was a whole other thing. So I used it as an opportunity to start sharing projects that my fellow students and some of the faculty were working on, and that quickly generated a lot of excitement. So the traffic blew up right away, and in the local community in SciArc, and then it started spreading out to other schools like UCLA. Friends, would start sharing links with each other, and just kind of naturally extended outside of that home base.
Man, I'm just thinking back now to the days of hearing the modem sounds and uploading everything to a server via FTP. And, index.html or HTML, and everything was done in simple text back in the day, right? It was just coded by hand, and stealing code from other websites. View source was a major part of building websites, and copying and pasting pieces out of that into your own text documents, uploading those, seeing what happened, tweaking it endlessly, iterating on all that. It was so fun. I just remember spending so many late hours doing that kind of stuff.
It was really exciting. And it was a time that I don't think many people will remember. Back then I would agonize over how to bring down the size of an image on the website by 5 kilobytes. It's these days, it's no problem to post an image that's 5 megabytes. But back then, a difference of 5 kilobytes would probably make a difference of a total of maybe a few minutes of download time when browsing different pages on a site. So yeah, and just, as you said, learning how to code through just looking at source code. It was kind of like moving to another country to pick up a language. I tried some of the earlier web design software like Dreamweaver and some of the other options that were available back in the 90s. And it all just it was really easy to use, but it created a lot of garbage code. And back then you couldn't
remember
afford.
You would look at that code and you're like, what is this stuff? It's not doing anything. And the more characters that were in the code, the more space it took up, right? And so it really was like, how do I do it the simplest way, but also get what I want? And yeah, I remember everybody's running a cracked version of Photoshop, right? A pirated version of Photoshop, because we were all students. And I'm sure Adobe was totally fine with that because they knew we were all getting addicted to Photoshop. And then we'd run everything through Graphic Converter to smash that file down as small as possible, like you were saying. So yeah, there's fond memories there.
And some of these values that I established back then have definitely stuck because these days everybody's got quick internet, but still there's just something about a very cleanly coded site with no bloat, images that are properly optimized. There's just a lot of beauty in that, and it's the kind of thing that I think most people online these days would never notice because everything loads fast.
That's true. But I think when you think about people who do code, they probably do think like that, right? They look for well-commented, cleanly structured code when they're building applications. And like this was my first foray into code beyond like when I was in the 5th grade learning Apple Basic to make something print on the screen, right? This was real coding. I mean, because it was turning code into layouts and images and, structured data like tables and things like that. And I felt like it's very different than the architectural process, which was messy and layered. And it didn't matter what it took to get to that end beautiful thing that was pinned up on the wall. It was all fair game, right? You could do anything. You could tear apart a model and glue it back together. And it was like Frankenstein, right? But the web was different. It was like minimal and it was beautiful. And in that minimalism, in that simple coding, and no extra characters, no extra kilobytes in the images. It was as lightweight as it could possibly be. And I felt like these are the kinds of things that informed the well-rounded kind of generalist nature that I've always kind of aspired to. I always want to do a lot of different things. And I felt like this was a interesting counterpoint to the architectural design process.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting take because I've always seen the similarities between creating a website and creating a building, but as you mentioned, there are some drastic differences as well in that process.
And now I think it's a lot different. The computer programs that architects use today are very much like the design process that we learned in school, which was, and I've always been a little bit like taken back by this. I always think it's a little bit weird because I'm very intentional with the way that I use software, but I see other people and they're just like breaking stuff and deleting stuff and replacing things. And they treat it very much like just having rolls of trace on the table. And it's interesting to think about how software is pretty resilient nowadays. Like Photoshop can take hundreds and hundreds of layers. You remember when we would like save a file and it would take 30 minutes to save, like preparing to save was a dialog box in Photoshop back then. Do you remember that? Like when it would try to start to take everything out of the RAM disk or the swap space and try to get it onto the hard drive that was tiny. I just remember we had to be really intentional even with our software back then. But nowadays it's like Revit files are gigabytes in size and Photoshop files are gigabytes in size. And every episode of my podcast is 200 gigs. It's enormous. Back then, like it was unheard of and you couldn't even think like that.
Yeah. I mean, I remember my first computer that I got, it was a Mac desktop in 95, and it had a 500 megabyte hard drive, 16 megabytes of RAM. And the guy at the store was like, you're never going to need another computer. I mean, this is going to last you forever. But yeah, it's interesting. It's like technology is increasing to allow us to be more sloppy and lazy. It's
more like humans. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of following a similar trend that we see in many parts of our lives, that we don't need to be that careful anymore to produce what seems fine.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's talk about community. I mean, there's one part of web design is creating kind of a presentation and a one-way type of communication. But the community that you have on ArchiConnect is multifaceted. There's lots of inputs coming into this, what people end up seeing on the screen. So how did you shift it away? Like you said, you started to share work of your fellow students and professors and things at SciArc, but how did you actually shift to becoming like a content hub that lots of people pushed information into?
It's interesting because it was kind of surprising at the time. I think it was maybe 1998 that I found some JavaScript chat widget that somewhere online, and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. You can have a live conversation with other people right through the website. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try this out, and I invited some well-known figures in architecture and other fields to have a scheduled time where they would come in, and I guess it was kind of an early version of AMA, Ask Me Anything. So I just set up this JavaScript chat box on the website and said, hey, this guy's coming on at 2:00 on Friday. Come in and ask him questions, chat with them. And the turnout was crazy. I mean, I had no idea that so many people were interested and willing, because back then it was like there wasn't really, people were chatting on ICQ.
How do you get the word out? Yeah, I mean, there were BBSs, and there weren't that many chat rooms out there at the time, maybe on AOL. And I mean, that was probably before what you're talking about, but like you could see how it led up to this, but it was still kind of asynchronous in a way, right? Like it was like you would put a message online and then you didn't know when somebody was going to respond to that. It was like check back in a day or 2 or 3 or a week and there might be a response. But to ICQ kind of changed that. Like that's kind of the early days of synchronous chat that happened online.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I saw this massive turnout to have these conversations, I mean, it was actually problematic because it was almost impossible to have a regular conversation given the format of these JavaScript chat widgets. It made me realize that I could probably just start a discussion forum so that people could just talk about whatever they want in different rooms and different threads. So I worked with a web designer friend of mine, and he developed a flat file discussion forum system. And right away, that just took off. Back then, there was no Facebook or Twitter or anything like that. So it became a place not so much to talk about architecture, but it's just a place for architects to come together and talk with each other about anything. So that really took off. There were limitations. There was no signing in. There was no verified accounts. There was no login required. Anybody could post a comment or a thread. They would just put in whatever name. If they left their name out, it would automatically default to your name because that was the text that was in the field. So a lot of people became your name. People were more civilized back then. So even though there was no registration or login or any moderation tools, it ran pretty smoothly, and people started showing up from all over the world, from different industries, and it was super exciting. And that changed a lot when social media came about, because all of a sudden everybody had the ability to create their own worlds and their own kind of small networks. So online forums, the nature has dramatically transformed since social media came in and allowed people to kind of exist within their own bubbles.
But your forum has persisted. The ArcConnect forum is there. It's super active. And so what's the right way to put this? Like, how has that happened? Because there are so many other, like blogging isn't even really a thing too much anymore, right? Everybody had a web blog back in the day. And because of social media, and in a couple of ways has kind of crushed blogging. It's not to say it doesn't have a place and it won't ever come back, but long form content is, most people don't participate in long form content besides like podcasts and maybe long lectures and stuff that are on YouTube, right? Like that's another thing that Facebook and Twitter have done, but the forum has persisted. And not to say that it's all long form content, but you do you guys do post articles on there. Your staff posts articles, you have contributors, and then there's comments on those, which kind of becomes a mini forum about a particular topic anyway, right? So how did that persist through all of this? Was it just because of the ties within the community and the people that were in it?
Well, there's a few different ways to look at that. One way, which might be the most simplistic, is that some people started to move away into Facebook and Twitter, where they can control the people that they're conversing with. I guess I've always thought of the forum on Archinect as like a big nightclub or a bar or a party. First of all, there's no freedom of speech rules, in a place like that. It's a private environment where if you misbehave or act in a way that pisses everybody off, you don't have the right to just stay forever. But it's I think that people start to become more selective with who they talk to. From 97 until now, the online population has dramatically increased. So a Wild West kind of format where anybody can join from around the world, I don't think would work that well anymore, because there's just too many people and there's too many topics. So I think some people decided to kind of curate their own worlds in which they kind of chat on a regular basis. And I think Archinect kind of took on more of a role of being a specialized place where architects are, and they don't necessarily need to know each other, but it's a place where if you want to talk about something architectural, or if you just want to talk about something with other architects, that's a place you can go. And there's no baggage. There's not necessarily an identity that you need to verify, since we don't require any real identity.
I'm just wondering how it persisted, right? Because I think you're alluding to many different ways in which people found it to be a safe place to do the things like you're talking about. And it starts to lead me to think about another topic that we brushed upon last time we talked, which was pseudonyms. A lot of people online, I think, coming back from when we started online, and there were movies out there that popularized this back in the day, right? But it was very, like The Matrix is a good example of this. Like there was Neo and there was Trinity, and people had these pseudonyms, and that's what they were known for. And with something as long lived as the Archinect Forum, I can imagine that there are pseudonyms that is the person's identity, but also that's starting to come back up again, as we talked about with crypto, starting to see that again quite often. And there are a lot of people online who, like on Twitter, who have also adopted that, but there's a lot of people who haven't, right? They're more comfortable tying their true identity to their thoughts and things. But I think, as we kind of previously discussed, there's good things about that, and there's bad things about that as well. So maybe we start to shift our topic more around that now with pseudonyms. Is what are the good and the bad things that you've seen at Archinect over the years based on that? Like one thing we talked about was you have a little bit more freedom to say what you really think, because no one knows who that's really attached to.
Yeah. I mean, just to kind of quickly go back to the original question about how are we still so active? How is the forum still so active? Part of that I don't really know, but some theories are that I feel like we do pay attention to our community, as opposed to some other, like, for example, Reddit or something. If somebody has a feature request, we'll pay attention to it. If somebody is complaining about somebody, we'll take it really seriously and do kind of a more thorough analysis of that user's activity to determine whether or not they should be kicked out or stay. Moving on to pseudonyms. Yeah, that's been a topic that we've debated for years, and there's no clear answer on whether pseudonyms are good or bad. I've heard from many people that I actually respect very much on Archinect that they could not possibly communicate with their own name. And these days, given the kind of culture we live in, where you have to be very careful about what you say, I understand that. I understand that a lot of these people are not just representing themselves, but they're representing the firms or the schools that they work at. And I've also heard from people that I respect a lot in the Archinect forum that are very strong in the belief that they do need to represent themselves, and they wish that everyone else would. But I do know that there have been some very valuable contributors over the years that would not have been contributors if they had to use their own name. That said, there have been some pretty nasty contributors on Archinect that drive me crazy, that I have then met in real life, and they've been extremely pleasant and a completely different person. So it shows the kind of disguise that people have, that anonymity gives people a lot of confidence, and that confidence can be a good thing or a bad thing.
I kind of think about road rage, right? It's like I have this cage around me that I'm driving 75 miles an hour down the freeway in, and I can do whatever I want because you don't know who I am. It's like it's a mask of sorts that you take on a persona potentially. Let's take a quick break to share more about our sponsors. In this podcast, I talk a lot about all the realities with my guests, mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality, all the realities. And I've got a new message for you from my friends at Avail. Let's talk about the new reality, which is that content, as I've talked about in the previous message from them, both wants and needs to live everywhere. Long gone are the days of saving files to your local hard drive or to a single on-premises server. In order to solve remote collaboration, information has moved to the edge. The cloud is king, and the number of cloud services out there dictate that the number of storage locations will continue to grow dramatically. Where do you store your files? BIM 360, OneDrive, SharePoint, Box, Dropbox, AWS, Azure. Chances are you probably save them in some weird combination of those that I just mentioned, and more. Well, here's the point of this message. Avail hides the complexity of where content and information resides. What file to use used to be your biggest concern. Now it's where do all those files live. Avail takes where out of the equation, which means that with Avail you can actually find your mission-critical and not-so-critical files too, right when you need them. Avail helps get you the information you need faster. Go to getavail.com today to learn more. Systems and standard operating procedures. You already know that's how to build a profitable business and find the freedom you want. You need systems and procedures. But you struggle with choosing the systems you need most and how to implement those systems quickly so you can get back to doing what you love most. The Designing Your Business Masterclass series was created by an acclaimed architect and business consultant, Douglas Teager, FAIA, to help fellow architects and engineers run their firms more profitably while maintaining a healthy work-life balance. Douglas grew from a solo practitioner to become managing partner of his 30-plus person firm, and then later sold his firm so he can do what he does today, helping architects be more successful at Teager Consulting. On the third Wednesday of every month, Douglas dives deep into an essential topic that will strengthen the profitability of your firm and make it sustainable for growth in the years to come. Register now for the Designing Your Business Masterclass with Douglas Teager at bqe.com/masterclass and start implementing powerful systems for the profitability you need and the freedom you want. Every live masterclass session includes AIA continuing education credit, and when you visit bqe.com/masterclass, you'll have access to the full library of past sessions on demand. The Designing Your Business Masterclass is free, and it's brought to you by our friends at BQE, the makers of BQE Core, the software that makes it easy to manage your projects and people for maximum productivity and ultimate profitability. Register now for the next Designing Your Business Masterclass at bqe.com/masterclass. That's bqe.com/masterclass. www.architectureandtechnnology.com/masterclass. And now let's get back to our conversation.
One time I was driving to an appointment, and there was a guy driving like a jerk, cutting in front of me, and then he fingering me, and then I was getting pissed off back, and we were both being immature and typical LA road rage. And then we keep on going the same way. We pull into the same parking lot, and I think, oh, great, we're pulling into the same parking lot. Turns out he was my physical therapist. I was getting physical therapy at the time. So and then we spent the next hour, working directly together. Didn't mention anything about it. We both pretended to not be aware, but that was really strange. But ended up, he was a super nice guy.
It could have been even better if he was your psychotherapist.
That would be interesting. From a lot of psychotherapists I know, I'm sure that they've got some pretty bad rage issues. They're not always the most healthy people.
They're not always the ones who should be asking the questions, right?
Yeah. So yeah. I mean, it's really hard to say, but even in an environment like Facebook, which does try to enforce that people use their real identity, they go to pretty big lengths to try to enforce that. There's still a lot of horrible stuff going on, and so people will, I don't know, we live in a very, very divisive time that I think people are feeling more and more confidence to stand their ground in a more extreme way than they used to. And that makes online discourse that much more difficult, especially because at least in person there's a little more civility that's usually involved.
And there's so many ways to interpret the written text that could be not the intended context at all, right? Or the tone, right? And I've always seen that in it happen with email or text messages, right? Where you assume the way that it was intended. And that could be completely opposite of the actual intention, depending on words or just your mental state at the time. And I could imagine there's been a lot of flame wars right on Arconnect that were total misunderstandings.
For sure. Yeah, it's absolutely true. There are, especially when it comes to the internet, because people in other parts of the world that exist in cultures that are foreign to, what each individual person is familiar with, they communicate in different ways. Some cultures are much more direct and straightforward. Others are very flowery in the way that they express themselves, ensuring that, with a lot of emojis. And yeah, absolutely, there's a lot of truth in how communication is perceived.
Yeah, there's I'm very non-confrontational, but there's people who are so direct that it doesn't bother them to have confrontation. Even thinking about how we're trained as architects to have a thick skin during these crazy crits that we pin our stuff up on the wall, and the juror comes in and it's all about them and their ego, and they shred you to pieces, and you learn to develop that thick skin. But I'll go online and it's like there's so many things out there that just instantly hurt your feelings, right? It's really interesting to think of how humans communicate and how well or not well we do that on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I definitely have developed a thick skin over the years, not just because it doesn't bother me as much about what people might say about me, but I've also come to realize that, everybody's got their own things going on, and, they're having a bad day, or maybe there's just the anonymity, and, so it's like you kind of take everything with a grain of salt. But, there's even celebrities that exist in the public realm that are, shutting down their Twitter accounts every day because they just can't handle the online abuse. So it's it can be pretty hard for people, and and it's one thing if I experience an attack online, I know that I feel a certain way about that. If I see someone else getting attacked online, it's a very different perspective. I kind of see both sides. I'm like, yeah, that guy who's attacking this guy is like out of his mind, and nobody can actually take this person seriously. But then that person will reach out to us and say like, hey, I'm being attacked online. And, sometimes I'll talk to them personally and say, it's, yeah, that really sucks. But I think it's pretty clear to all of our readers that this person is there's something going on with them. Yeah, but it's hard to not take things like that personally.
Yeah. I think about Archinect as kind of it's like a subculture or a counterculture movement within architecture. Would you characterize it that way? I think SciArc is similarly characterized in my mind like that. I didn't go there, but I think of it as like splintering off from Cal Poly in its earliest days with Ray Cappy, and that was kind of one of the big pushes then. It just felt very countercultural. But do you see Archinect kind of the same DNA as that?
I think so. And I think that it's probably not so much a conscious decision, but it just may have naturally evolved, maybe because I came out of a community like SciArc, and I hire people that are kind of like-minded. We do recognize that we may be kind of a subculture of the industry when, sometimes our articles will blow up virally and we'll get a much wider architectural audience to an article than our typical audience. And we'll get very different feedback. It's especially in the last couple of years when we've been addressing a lot of issues of racial inequities. There's a pretty big, conservative, straight up racist component of our industry that still exists, and it's made quite clear when our content reaches outside of our immediate, more regular audience. I mean, that's just one example, but there are a variety of different kind of subcultures in architecture that I feel like I am not that familiar with, and probably a lot of our audience is not that familiar with. It's a big industry.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that it is kind of a subculture of the industry, and the internet has enabled those people to find each other through places like your landing page. But what kinds of stories like that are you talking about? Like, I can imagine you guys break some kind of news that most other people wouldn't even publish, because there's more of this. To me, it feels like there's this ad hoc kind of nature to, like, we don't specifically talk about certain types of stories within architecture. It's like, this is architecture laid to bare, like the bare metal of architecture. Is that fair to say as well? I'm just thinking, like, with Archinect's kind of, I don't know, punk rock attitude, it feels like to me, right? That we're not afraid to touch any subject. This is, and it cuts very deep into the realities of working within the architectural profession. And it doesn't seem like there's any topics that are off topic on Archinect. And so therefore I could imagine it just bleeds architecture, right? And good or bad, it just seems like there's nothing that's off limits.
I think that's true to a certain point. The first kind of slap in the face of, I wouldn't say censorship, but, back in the early days of Archinect, our tagline was pimping architecture since 1997. And that was the tagline that lasted until the early 2000s. So probably for about 5 years after we launched in 97. And it was around 2004 that I decided to make Archinect a real business. Until 2004, I had my own design company on the side. That was my work. Archinect was just a passion project that I would spend too much time working on, and I intentionally avoided any kind of advertising revenue. I didn't want to make any money because I knew as soon as the site started making money, then it would get serious, and I wasn't really ready for it to be serious. But then when I did, partially because I realized my passion was Archinect much more so than our client work. The first big advertiser that we had, they were ready to sign the contract, and they said, this tagline "Pimpin' Architecture" since '97. There's some people on our team that are not feeling very comfortable with putting our brand next to that line. And I got it. Pimping is a loaded word. So we changed it. We changed it to making architecture more connected since 1997. And since then, though, we have avoided making any kind of partnerships or advertising relationships with any company or person that would enforce any kind of rules or requests for what we cover. We figure that if we cover what we believe is right to cover, people will respect that. And as a result, we get a lot of pushback from people that don't agree with us, but that doesn't change our attitude. Sometimes somebody on our team will say like, "Hey, we got some pretty harsh feedback on this article." And my response is usually like, "Yeah, there's two harsh examples of feedback from this article, but this article is also doing really well with a lot of people. So it's like it's a small minority of people that are having a problem with it, and those people are probably just not, our content's not for them."
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How many different would you? I mean, this might be a bad way to characterize it, but how many generations of people do you think are on Archinect?
Well, it's interesting. One of the reasons that I wanted to start a podcast back in 2014 was because I started hearing from some of the people that were regulars on Archinect in the late 90s and early 2000s, and they were saying, I don't have time these days to get online and read forums and even read the news. I'm so busy, running a practice or just working as an architect. So one of the main target audiences for the podcast at the time was just those people that used to be on Archinect all the time, and now they only have time to maybe catch up on things for 30 minutes, an hour, once a week. There are, considering that a lot of the people that were on Archinect back in the late 90s were architecture students, let's say 20 years old in 99. They're mid 40s now, so, and the site did not only appeal to young people back then. There were, older people, a lot of professors, a lot of older architects. So I would say, at least 2 to 3 generations of people have been on Archinect.
I think that's super interesting because that to me parallels how a lot of offices are today. And I would say offices have more like 4 or 5 generations in them. Even if you think about someone who's just coming out of school and someone who's basically retirement age, there's a lot of generation mix going on there. And I think the younger generations would probably characterize the older generations as not being too involved online. And that is that's something that I see on Archinect is you can just kind of tell by the way some people write and share their experiences that they've been around for a while. And I think that is super interesting. And I think a compelling reason to be on there because you do see that wide range of viewpoints that are in the industry today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love it when I see people with more experience chime in. One problematic issue with a lot of topics that are discussed these days is that the topics are most actively discussed among very young people in the industry, which is great. I mean, the next generation of architects, I have tremendous amount of confidence in because I feel like they are setting themselves up to make some real change in the industry that the industry has needed for generations. But the problem is that we don't have enough more experienced sounding boards to kind of provide some more experienced wisdom into the conversation to to balance, the idealism with the real world implications of some of those things. And I think, just yesterday we published an op-ed by a friend of mine, Michael Pinto. I don't know if you know Michael Pinto. We were at SciArc together. Now he runs. He's I think the design director at NAC Architects in LA. He graduated from SciArc. He's worked at boutique firms. He's worked at corporate firms. So he wrote an op-ed about what's going on at SciArc right now and all the controversy that's happening with some of the faculty and just the bigger issues that have come up. And his perspective, I thought, was just such a nice, refreshing perspective because it was able to back up a lot of the ideals that young people have with experience and evidence that, yes, this is possible, what you're wanting to do. And I've seen it myself. It's not like, but we need to get the whole industry on board here to experience the changes that I've had the benefit of seeing for myself in the last 20 years.
Yeah. I think that was an interesting. It's not a scandal necessarily. Well, it's maybe some pieces of it are, but that whole topic has been super interesting. My co-host and I covered it on our other show, ArchiSpeak, which has gotten a little bit of talk, but I think one thing that we actually just recorded a follow-up episode regarding that topic for a bit of a tangent here, which was, why aren't we seeing more people actually talk about this? Because I think that this is all about, it's not about canceling certain individuals. It's about this conversation being allowed to bubble to the surface, which for decades, this conversation has not been enabled to bubble to the surface. And here it is. And I think it's a huge, huge, huge opportunity in so many ways to take care of some of these problems that have been in the industry for so long and actually understand it from all these different angles, because it was being presented from 2 or 3 like really specific points of view. And that's what people are reacting to. But there's a whole gradient out there of perspective on these issues about why you're going to school, what you're going to do after school, where you're going to work after school, what your career is going to be like. I think that there's, and that's one thing I appreciate on ArchConnect, right, is that there is this ability for you guys to kind of cover it from many different angles and for everyone to kind of weigh in a safe place to do that. There's various levels of safety there, I'm sure, right? But it's that people don't feel like they can't speak up on a place like ArchConnect.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing that's come out of this recent controversy that was ignited with the panel at SciArc was that it has inspired a lot of other people to share their stories of when they were young or when they were in school. And the consistent theme was that these stories that happened years ago, and it's not necessarily a long time ago, even 5 years ago, even 2 or 3 years ago, was that those problems were brought up with administrations or with upper level members of an organization, and were just swept under the rug. And some apologies were made, but we're at a time right now where that people are feeling more empowered to share those stories, which can be very risky. I've heard some personal stories from people that have been really shocking, but they have no interest in bringing it up publicly because they know that it will change their lives in some way, and they're just not ready for it. But yeah, no, these days with online communities and empowered individuals, the consequences are much greater. And I think people realize that, the whole cancel culture thing. I think that there are many instances where it's unfair, but do some people need to be sacrificed in order for everyone to be shaking in their boots about behaving properly, or behaving improperly to make that change? Maybe, maybe real world consequences and real world examples of people facing consequences is what's necessary.
Do you see ArchConnect as being a place that gives voice to those who need an outlet like this to share these kinds of things? Yeah.
Definitely. It's not always easy to get people to share issues that they feel uncomfortable talking about, but we always try to provide a platform. We've been in communication with, for example, the recent incident at Shop Architects, the unionization effort at Shop. We were in communication with some of the people, some of the architects at Shop that were involved in this, and they didn't want to go on the record, which I totally understand. But we wanted to provide that platform for them to have a place to speak their mind and share. But then again, we can't report on serious allegations without doing our due diligence and ensuring that the information is correct. We have a personal responsibility and a legal vulnerability, but I think ethically we need to make sure that the information that people share on ArcConnect is true.
Okay, we could start to wrap up here. I have a couple more ideas, but I'll just throw this one out there and we'll see where it goes, which is, what is the best thing about architectural community online with ArcConnect or in general?
I think as a parent of teenagers, I see the incredible toll that social media and online communities can have on kids in achieving this kind of unrealistic state of perfection in their lives. But I also, through my experience just with ArcConnect and the forum and the internet in general, it's also provided a place where people can share their problems with each other. And I think we're at a time, in history where it's unprecedented in that people are feeling okay with acknowledging that they may be suffering from things that previous generations may have felt like really lonely in. And now they're recognizing that it's not their own problem. It's a problem that a lot of people share. And in architecture, there's a lot of issues that come up. There's a lot of mental health issues that arise in architecture. We've covered mental health a lot on ArcConnect, and part of the reason for that is to raise awareness about the kind of more endemic issues that exist not only in architecture but in our culture in general. And I think it has helped. I think that's part of the reason why people are feeling empowered to make change, because they're starting to recognize that the change that has always bothered them personally is a necessary change that their community needs.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about, and how you've kind of provided a place for that to happen. Because, like you said, I think growing up in the profession of architecture, you're very much kind of in a silo of maybe a small friend group within an office. And there's certain things you can and can't say at that office, but because of the internet, right? And I think there's still a lot of people who practice out there who are totally, I don't want to say ignorant, but ignorant of the internet, that it exists and that it has changed everything. And so for people to be able to it's not just about not feeling lonely, but find people who have had similar experiences that can then help them navigate through this profession, and that isn't just in their small friend group and it's not in their office, is huge. And I think that's one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you about ArcConnect today, is because it's provided a place for people to do exactly that. And it could be the good and the bad, but it's the common fabric that weaves everybody together within this profession, at least the ones who are willing to participate in that. And I think you can't understate the role that plays in a lot of people's day to day.
Yeah, I mean, when before the internet, a typical architect would probably have a group of maybe 10 to 20 people that they could share their thoughts with, either at a firm or in school. But the internet has brought about this possibility to discuss issues, very specific issues, at depth with people from all over the world. So it's that difference has a big impact.
Well, Paul, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to kind of walk us through the history, but also through I think these more interesting, delicate, potentially issues that are all about having a community and in this case online. But I really commend you for, sticking with it. This is like you said, it started out as kind of this labor of love, like to kind of the side hustle of sorts, right? That turned into the main hustle. And I think it's a force online that a lot of people should check out. Where can people follow what's going on with ArcConnect? Obviously, it's arconnect.com, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Is there anywhere else that people can see or that they should know about, or any ask of the audience that you might have?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to, for those listeners that are interested in community, I would love to get more people with, positive things to share to get involved, because I know that it can be a little intimidating, getting it onto our forum, and there are a lot of bullies, in the forum, and it can be, to try to stick it out, because we could use more positivity, more experienced wisdom in the forum as always. But so yeah, arconnect.com. We're on all the socials at ArcConnect. If you're looking for a job, there's a lot of it's just for anybody out there that's thinking about a career change. There's never been a better time than right now. So we've got a lot of job opportunities on ArcConnect on ArcConnect's job board. Yeah, it's our 25th anniversary, so we're planning on some big updates this year, and I'm not going to make any promises right now, but stay tuned.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. All right. Well, Paul, thanks so much for hanging out with us today and sharing and taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for your interest. It was I really enjoyed it.
Thank you to Avail for their support of this podcast episode. Visit getavail.com to see their holistic approach to content management today. Thank you to BQE, the makers of BQE Core, for their support of this podcast episode. Visit bqe.com/masterclass to register for the next Designing Your Business Masterclass. This show is part of the Gable Media Podcast Network. You can see all the shows at gablemedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what I'm doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and of course, share it with your friends. I'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at trxl.co/podcast, where you can find every episode. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. Just search for E. Troxel. Talk to you soon.